Eleanor Hayes stood in the center of the Wallingford Grand Ballroom, wearing a pale ivory dress that made her look like she belonged in a painting rather than at the wedding of the man who once promised to spend forever with her. 200 guests filled the room, crystal glasses catching the light from a chandelier that cost more than most people's homes. She had come alone, composed, her hands folded gently in front of her, watching the man she had loved for nearly a decade exchange vows with another woman just hours earlier. Nobody in that room knew who she really was. Not the caterers, not the string quartet, not even the bride standing at the center of it all in white silk, glowing with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing you have already won everything there is to win. Vanessa Price raised her glass toward the crowd, smiling the practiced smile of someone who had spent months rehearsing this exact moment in front of a mirror. She tapped her fork gently against the crystal, and the room quieted, every eye turning toward her. She thanked her guests for coming, thanked her new husband Gerald Cole for choosing her, and then, almost as an afterthought, she turned her gaze toward Eleanor, standing quietly near the edge of the dance floor. Her smile did not fade, but something behind her eyes sharpened, the kind of look a woman gives when she wants an audience to witness exactly what she is about to do. She lifted her glass higher and said the words slowly, deliberately, savoring every syllable. "To new beginnings," she said, and for one suspended second, nobody in the room understood what was about to happen next. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened next unfolded in less than 3 seconds, but for Eleanor, it felt as though time itself had slowed to nothing. Vanessa tipped her glass forward, and a stream of deep red wine poured directly down the front of Eleanor's ivory dress, splashing against the white marble floor beneath her feet. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a fork. A woman near the back audibly whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough for half the room to hear. Eleanor did not flinch, did not cry out, did not reach for a napkin the way anyone else might have. She simply stood there, wine dripping slowly down the fabric of her dress, staring directly into the eyes of the woman who had just tried to humiliate her in front of everyone who mattered to Gerald's career and his family name. What none of them knew was that the woman standing there, wine dripping onto white marble, could have bought the entire hotel they were standing in, twice over. She could have purchased the building, the land beneath it, and every business connected to the holding company that employed half the guests in that room, without so much as blinking or consulting an accountant. The daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country was standing in a $500 dress she had chosen specifically because it would not draw attention, quietly absorbing a public humiliation from a woman who had no idea she was standing 3 feet away from more power and money than her new husband's entire company was worth. Eleanor reached into her small clutch, pulled out her phone, and made one single call, her voice steady, as the photographer unknowingly documented the exact moment everything was about to change forever. To understand why that single phone call would end up unraveling 3 lives in the span of one evening, we have to go back 4 years, long before Vanessa Price ever set foot inside the offices of Cole and Ashford Holdings, and long before Eleanor Hayes ever agreed to marry a man who had no idea who her father was. 3 questions sat at the center of everything that was about to unfold. Why had Eleanor spent nearly her entire adult life hiding the truth about her family from the man she loved most? Did Gerald know any part of the truth when he chose to leave her, or was his decision built entirely on assumptions he never bothered to question? And when the truth finally surfaced in front of 200 witnesses, what would it cost the woman who had just poured wine down the dress of a stranger she believed she could humiliate without consequence? Eleanor met Gerald Cole during her final year of graduate school, in a small coffee shop near the university library, where she worked part-time to cover rent on a modest 1-bedroom apartment. Gerald was ambitious even then, sharp, well-spoken, the kind of young man professors singled out as destined for something bigger than the rest of his classmates. Eleanor never told him where she truly came from. She let him believe she was simply another working student, paying her own way through school, because for the first time in her life, she wanted someone to choose her without knowing what her last name could offer him. Her father, Franklin Hayes, was one of the wealthiest industrialists in the country, but Eleanor had walked away from that world years earlier, after a bitter falling out that left her unwilling to use his name for anything, even love. Gerald and Eleanor married 3 years after they met, in a small ceremony attended by close friends and Gerald's mother, Margaret Cole, a woman who adored Eleanor from the very first afternoon they spent together in her kitchen. Margaret often said that Eleanor carried herself like someone who had nothing to prove, a quality she found increasingly rare among the young women her son worked alongside. For a while, their marriage was simple and steady, built on long conversations and quiet evenings rather than status or spectacle. But as Gerald climbed higher within Cole and Ashford Holdings, earning promotion after promotion, something in him began to shift. He grew embarrassed by Eleanor's modest job at the hospital, embarrassed by her refusal to attend certain events, embarrassed, though he never said it outright, by a wife who seemed to want less than everyone around him wanted. It was during this period that Vanessa Price joined the firm as a junior associate, transferred in from a competing company, with a reputation for being both brilliant and relentlessly ambitious. She was charming in the way that made executives trust her instantly, and calculating in the way that made her colleagues quietly wary of her. She noticed Gerald long before he ever noticed her, studying the way he spoke in meetings, the way certain partners deferred to him, the way his frustration with his own marriage occasionally slipped through in small comments during long nights at the office. Margaret, visiting for dinner one evening, watched the two of them interact for only a few minutes before pulling her son aside in the kitchen and telling him quietly that he had no idea what Eleanor had given up for him, a warning Gerald brushed aside without a second thought. The affair between Gerald and Vanessa did not begin all at once. It built slowly, through late nights working on a merger that required frequent travel, through comments that started as harmless and became increasingly personal, through a business trip to Chicago where the two of them spent an evening at a rooftop bar long after the rest of the team had gone back to their hotel rooms. Eleanor noticed the changes the way most spouses do, not through any single dramatic discovery, but through a slow accumulation of small details. A missed call returned too quickly, a hotel receipt for a restaurant Gerald claimed he never visited, a change to the passcode on his phone that had never needed changing before. She said nothing at first, choosing instead to watch, to wait, to see whether the man she married would tell her the truth on his own. He never did. Instead, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening, Gerald sat Eleanor down at their kitchen table and told her, in the calm, practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed the conversation many times in his head, that he was leaving her for Vanessa. He framed it as a practical decision, as though their marriage had simply become an inefficient arrangement that no longer served either of them, rather than the end of nearly a decade of shared life. Eleanor listened without raising her voice. She asked for nothing in the divorce that followed, not alimony, not a share of the assets they had built together, not even the furniture they had picked out on a modest budget during their first year of marriage. She signed every document without argument, packed her belongings into a handful of boxes, and disappeared quietly from the social circle she and Gerald had built together over the years. On the night she moved out for the last time, carrying the final box down to a car waiting outside their apartment building, something happened that Gerald never noticed and would never learn about until months later. A black car with a private driver was parked at the curb, engine running, waiting specifically for Eleanor. She climbed inside without explanation, the driver pulling away into traffic as Gerald stood at the window of the apartment they once shared, watching the taillights disappear. Believing he was simply watching his ex-wife leave in a rideshare he assumed she had called herself. He had no reason to imagine that the car had been sent by a household staff he did not know existed to an estate he had never once been told about, belonging to a father-in-law he never knew he had. The estate belonged to Franklin Hayes, and it sat nearly 2 hours outside the city, hidden behind stone walls and private security that most residents of the surrounding county had learned not to ask questions about. Eleanor had not spoken to her father in nearly 6 years before that night, not since a bitter argument during her 20s over his attempt to arrange a marriage between her and the son of a business partner, a merger disguised as a wedding that Eleanor refused outright, choosing instead to walk away from his money entirely and build a modest life on her own terms. Franklin never forgave himself for how far he had pushed her, and in the years since, he had quietly kept track of her from a distance, respecting her wish for independence, while never fully letting go of the hope that she would one day return. When Eleanor arrived at the estate that night, exhausted and carrying the weight of a marriage that had just ended, Franklin met her at the door himself, something the household staff had never once seen him do for anyone. He did not ask about Gerald immediately. He simply held his daughter for a long moment in the entryway, apologizing for years of silence neither of them had been ready to break sooner. Over the following weeks, father and daughter slowly began rebuilding what had been lost, quiet dinners turning into quiet conversations, old wounds finally given room to heal. It was during one particular dinner, several months into their reconciliation, that Franklin asked Eleanor a question that would quietly change the direction of everything still to come. He asked, simply and directly, for Gerald's full name and the name of the company he worked for. Eleanor answered without thinking much of it, unaware that her father already recognized the name the moment it left her lips. Franklin Hayes was, through a private holding structure few outside his innermost circle knew anything about, the majority shareholder of the very company that employed Gerald Cole. He had acquired the parent group years earlier as a quiet investment, long before Eleanor had ever met Gerald, and had never once connected the two facts until that dinner. He said nothing to Eleanor that evening, beyond a few careful questions about how her ex-husband had treated her during the marriage, but from that point forward, he began quietly paying closer attention to the internal affairs of Cole and Ashford Holdings, watching a man he had never met rise through a company that, without knowing it, ultimately answered to him. Gerald's career, meanwhile, continued to accelerate at a pace that startled even his most confident colleagues. Within a year of the divorce, he was promoted to senior vice president, and Vanessa, now firmly established as his partner in both his professional and personal life, pushed him toward an increasingly public lifestyle, one built around galas, press coverage, and the kind of status she had spent her entire career chasing. She insisted on a large, lavish wedding, one designed as much to announce their arrival among the city's elite as it was to celebrate their relationship. Beneath the surface of her confidence, however, Vanessa carried a quiet insecurity about Eleanor that never fully faded. She searched for information about her online more than once, frustrated by how little she could find, unsettled by a woman who seemed to have simply vanished without leaving any trace of resentment or bitterness behind her. Unbeknownst to Vanessa or Gerald, Franklin's attorney, a careful and deeply loyal man named Robert Ashcombe, had already begun a quiet internal review of leadership across Cole and Ashford Holdings, conducted under the authority of the holding company Franklin controlled. Nothing about the review was made public, and nothing about it reached Gerald directly, but it laid the groundwork for decisions that would later unfold with startling speed. Around the same time, Vanessa made a decision of her own, one driven entirely by a desire to finally put Eleanor in her place once and for all. She had an invitation sent directly to Eleanor for the wedding, framed publicly as a gracious, forgiving gesture, but privately intended as a calculated humiliation, an opportunity to force Eleanor to stand quietly on the sidelines and watch the life she had supposedly failed to hold on to. Diane Foster, Eleanor's closest friend since childhood, urged her not to go, worried that attending would only invite unnecessary pain into a life Eleanor had worked so hard to rebuild. Eleanor considered it seriously, sitting with the decision for several quiet days before finally telling Diane she intended to accept the invitation, not out of weakness or lingering attachment to Gerald, but because her father had quietly insisted on accompanying her, offering no explanation beyond a calm assurance that it was time. Eleanor trusted him enough not to ask further questions, sensing that something larger than a simple wedding invitation was moving forward, something she herself did not yet fully understand, though she suspected her father's decision to appear that evening was not going to be simple at all. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension that most of the guests never noticed. Vanessa grew increasingly particular about every detail, obsessing over seating arrangements, flowers, and most of all, the exact placement Eleanor would occupy in the room, ensuring she would be visible enough to witness everything without ever being close enough to feel like an equal among the other guests. Margaret Cole, watching her son's fiancé manage every detail with cold precision, grew quieter than usual, offering only polite support in public, while privately confiding to a close friend that she feared what kind of marriage her son was truly walking into. Gerald himself experienced brief, fleeting moments of doubt in the days before the ceremony, though he pushed each one aside quickly, telling himself that whatever unease he felt was simply ordinary wedding nerves. On the evening of the wedding, Franklin Hayes arrived separately from his daughter, dressed simply, deliberately unremarkable among the crowd of executives and business partners filling the ballroom, many of whom worked for companies within his own private holding structure without ever having met him personally. He greeted no one, drew no attention, and took a seat near the back of the room, watching quietly as the ceremony began. Eleanor arrived alone shortly afterward, composed and elegant in her understated ivory dress, immediately becoming the subject of hushed whispers and pointed glances from women in Vanessa's social circle, who had heard just enough about her past with Gerald to find her presence irresistibly interesting. Before the ceremony began, Vanessa found a private moment to corner Eleanor near the coat check, delivering a quiet, cutting reminder about exactly whose wedding this was and exactly where Eleanor now stood in comparison. Eleanor said nothing in response beyond a calm, polite nod, refusing to give Vanessa the reaction she seemed so desperate to provoke. As the ceremony concluded and the reception began, the atmosphere in the ballroom grew warmer, filled with laughter, music, and the easy confidence of people who believed they understood exactly how the evening would unfold. What none of them understood was that every person in that room who truly mattered to the future of Cole and Ashford Holdings was already quietly watching Vanessa, waiting to see exactly how she would choose to treat the quiet woman standing near the edge of the dance floor. When Vanessa rose to give her toast, raising her glass toward the crowd with practiced confidence, she had no idea that the next 30 seconds of her life were about to become the most consequential decision she would ever make. The moment the wine left Vanessa's glass and struck the front of Eleanor's dress, something shifted permanently in that room, even before anyone understood why. Eleanor's calm, unshaken response unsettled Vanessa more than tears or anger ever could have. Rather than reacting, Eleanor simply reached for her phone and made one quiet call, her expression unreadable, as the room buzzed with whispered speculation about what she might do next. Within minutes, that single phone call reached Franklin Hayes directly, and those closest to him would later describe his reaction not as loud or dramatic, but as a controlled, deliberate calm that felt far more unsettling than shouting ever could. He said very little, simply instructing Robert Ashcombe, who had been quietly present at the wedding the entire evening without anyone realizing his significance, that it was time. Robert moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency, making a handful of calls that set months of prior preparation into immediate motion, all of it built upon the internal review he had conducted long before this wedding was ever planned. Meanwhile, Gerald and Vanessa remained completely unaware that anything beyond an embarrassing spectacle had occurred, continuing to greet guests and pose for photographs, believing the humiliating moment had already passed without any lasting consequence. That illusion shattered the moment a hotel manager approached Gerald quietly at the edge of the dance floor, informing him that someone urgently needed to speak with him in the private lounge adjoining the ballroom, someone the manager described only as extremely insistent and clearly accustomed to being obeyed without question. Gerald excused himself, expecting perhaps an issue with the catering bill or a minor complaint from a disgruntled guest. Instead, he found Franklin Hayes standing quietly in the lounge, along with Robert Ashcombe, and, a few steps behind them, Eleanor herself, her dress still stained, her composure entirely intact. Franklin introduced himself simply, extending a hand Gerald was too stunned to immediately accept, explaining in a calm, measured voice that he was the father of the woman Gerald had once been married to, and, as it happened, also the majority owner of the parent holding company that controlled every division of Cole and Ashford Holdings, including the one Gerald currently led. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Gerald to feel it settle physically across his chest. Word of the confrontation spread through the reception with startling speed, passed in hushed tones between guests, who suddenly understood why an unfamiliar older man had been sitting quietly near the back of the room all evening. Vanessa, sensing the shift in energy before she fully understood its cause, made her way toward the lounge just in time to hear Franklin calmly explain, in front of both Gerald and a small cluster of stunned executives who had followed out of curiosity, that Eleanor had never needed his wealth to prove anything about her worth, but that tonight she had allowed him the opportunity to show the room exactly what certain people had chosen to throw away. Vanessa attempted, in a rapid and increasingly desperate tone, to apologize directly to Eleanor, insisting she never would have acted the way she did had she simply known the truth beforehand. Franklin's response was brief and unflinching. He told Vanessa plainly that the fact she believed her cruelty was only unacceptable because of who Eleanor's father turned out to be was, in itself, the clearest possible demonstration of exactly the kind of character his daughter had quietly walked away from years earlier. Within days, the consequences began moving through Cole and Ashford Holdings with quiet, deliberate speed. Gerald was called into a series of closed-door meetings with the holding company's board, meetings he had no leverage to influence given who now controlled the majority ownership above him. Over the following weeks, his responsibilities were gradually reassigned, his authority quietly diminished, until he was ultimately eased out of the company entirely under the polite, procedural language executives use when someone has clearly lost the confidence of ownership. Vanessa's downfall unfolded even more publicly. A guest at the wedding had captured a video of the wine incident on their phone, and although it began circulating quietly among mutual friends at first, it eventually spread further, reaching people within Vanessa's own extended social and professional circles. The story attached to the video, once people learned who Eleanor truly was, transformed almost overnight from an ordinary moment of wedding drama into a story people simply could not stop discussing. Invitations Vanessa once received without effort slowly stopped arriving. Friends who had spent years courting her attention grew distant, unwilling to be associated with a woman now widely known for having humiliated the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country without any idea of the consequences that decision would carry. Margaret Cole, watching her son's marriage and career collapse within the same season, found herself reconnecting warmly with Eleanor in the months that followed, their relationship settling back into the easy comfort it had always carried before the divorce ever happened. Margaret often told Eleanor, during quiet afternoons together, that she had always known there was something remarkable about her, long before any of them understood exactly how remarkable it truly was. Eleanor, for her part, never sought public vindication or further confrontation. When she and Gerald crossed paths one final time, at a quiet meeting arranged to finalize a few remaining legal matters between their families, she offered no bitterness, no lingering anger, only a calm, steady statement that she had finally come to understand her own worth long before that wedding ever happened, and that nothing about that evening had changed who she already knew herself to be. In the months that followed, Eleanor stepped more fully into her role alongside her father, not as an heiress chasing recognition, but as a woman finally at peace with a past she no longer needed to hide from anyone. She continued working at the hospital for a while longer, choosing her own pace for whatever came next, while slowly beginning to take a more active role in the philanthropic side of her father's business empire, work that felt far closer to who she had always wanted to be. Gerald, by contrast, found himself starting over in a much smaller, quieter version of the career he once had, while Vanessa, isolated from the circle she had worked so hard to enter, faded from the public conversations that once revolved so eagerly around her. What began as a single, careless act of cruelty in front of 200 witnesses ultimately became the very moment that revealed exactly who each of them truly was. Would you have recognized the quiet strength Eleanor carried long before anyone else in that room understood who she really was? Let us know in the comments what part of her story stayed with you the longest. And if this story moved you, wait until you hear what happens when a quiet housekeeper, overlooked for decades by the family she served, is written out of a will everyone assumed she had no claim to, only for the truth of who she really was to change everything the family thought they understood about their own inheritance. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming stories.